Don't walk into the umpire. I mean, you can't defend that.
You cannot make contact with an umpire.
That's the one thing you know you don't do. You don't approach umpires.
You do not do that to an umpire.
He sees the umpire that's involved and doesn't deviate and makes contact. Now, whether it's slide or not, that's disrespectful in anyone's language.
The moment kids first get into the game of football, they have to understand that the umpire's off limits. Respect the person, respect the position, respect the role that they play. And unfortunately, Toby hasn't done that.
Got to grow up, obviously. You can't treat umpires like this. That was a shocking look for the game.
I don't think we can condone at all contact with umpires. You just can't do that sort of stuff, and it's a good reminder to everyone.
You know, what happens in football is a couple of non-negotiables. One is you don't abuse and you don't go near umpires, you respect them for what they bring to the game. Would it be a terrible game without them? It's a difficult situation, but it looks reasonably clear.
For all those people screaming, jumping up and down, talking about the Toby tax, Toby tax, that doesn't apply here. Toby's put himself in this situation.
The facts of the matter are, there it was. He had the opportunity. He initiated the contact. He had alternatives all over the place.
He has to be suspended for that action.
It's too much of a distraction. Like, every month we're talking about an incident with Toby Greene.
He's put himself in a position where he's not going to be there again on the weekend. And it's a travesty for that footy club.
Unfortunately, one of the players that we love watching the most week in, week out, we don't get to see week in, week out because he does things like this. And it's really, really disappointing.
A landmark case for length alone is up for debates on the 360 agenda. Toby Greene's season ended, suspended for 3 matches for making intentional contact with an umpire, but it might not be over, as the AFL is most displeased. Victoria concedes the grand final can't be staged at the MCG for a second straight season, meaning Perth will host that one day in September. And we'll head inside this final series with our players. Christian Petrarca in the Wests and safely into the prelim, while Adam Treloar and his dogs survive and are now bound for Brisbane. I'm Gerard Waitley, here's Jonathan Brown. This Tuesday night, it's footy from all angles. Brownie, welcome.
Great to be on, Gerard. Just another quiet night in football, isn't it?
You've chosen your moment well.
Last time you got me in, it was for the David Mackay incident.
You're our tribunal
What am I
specialist.
doing here? So, under a little bit of pressure, but looking forward to chatting through the case. It's obviously gripped the whole AFL world by storm, hasn't it?
I wonder if it had something to do with your record at one stage. I remember sitting through a few of your early tribunal cases.
Yes, that's right, yeah. I remember seeing you in the public gallery, and there was one year there where the public gallery kept growing and growing, so I turned up about 6 times, but eventually I learned a lesson, which unfortunately at this stage, Toby Greene hasn't been able to learn the lesson, which we'll get to.
All right, we'll step through that. Coming up, we do have our players with us tonight, so Christian Petrarca and Adam Treloar are in their compounds with their teams, the way the world is at the moment. We'll play some real or overreaction, particularly around those teams who might have stumbled a bit on the weekend of what it means for their prospects from here. But top of the agenda, across more than 4 hours this morning and into the afternoon, the football world was transfixed by the case of Toby Greene. It was vigorously disputed on every front from the moment that Greene and the Giants entered the plea of not guilty, and never more so than when the penalty was considered. So a guilty verdict, the AFL got what it was seeking on that front, but the penalty of 3 matches, that has the league in particular most unhappy.
Yeah, I guess I welcomed the tribunal verdict that it was intentional conduct and handing down a sanction. If I'm honest, I find it personally, and I need to be careful, hard to reconcile how it can be intentional conduct that was aggressive, demonstrative and disrespectful. I think it was found to be all of those things, and then only be 3 weeks. You know, we asked for 6. These are the facts, and it's at 3. And I'm finding that personally hard to reconcile how it can only be 3 weeks. So I would say to, you know, I guess as the CEO of the league, I'm saying to community leagues and others that I find that decision perplexing. And so I just, you know, I don't think I can say that I thought, well, that I've said enough. Yeah, I've spoken to the lawyers about our appeal rights, clearly. So they're looking at that at the moment.
And clearly the AFL now has no option other than to appeal. Brownie, compromise verdicts lack courage and conviction, and regrettably that's what that jury did today. Faced with what was necessary and asked for by the league, who had proven their case, countered by virtually no, or certainly no penalty in terms of suspension, regrettably this jury split the middle, and it is the least satisfactory verdict I've seen in my time covering the tribunal.
Well, that's a big statement, isn't it? Geez, the boss was passionate, wasn't he? Very rarely you see him wade into those sorts of things, which he's got every right to, but he was passionate about, so he set the scene for a potential appeal. No doubt about it. I agree, there had to be a suspension. I know you've been strong on it throughout, and a lot of the football world has, but you can't downplay 3 weeks in a final series, semi-final, preliminary final and a potential grand final.
So do you think there is waiting from your brethren of former players to say that these 3 actually equal more than that?
I think it's double. And I've been in a situation, Jared, where I've faced my finals life, if you want, in 2004, where I was up after a win in a qualifying final. We had the week off, so I only had 1 week up my sleeve. If my team won a preliminary final. So the feeling I had walking to the gallows that night was unbelievable. I thought, geez, the prospects of losing a grand final spot, this will live with me in my heart for the rest of my life, that I let my teammates down. So tonight, it would be a heavy weight that Toby Greene's carrying, so don't downplay the 3 weeks. So I agree with the suspension, but I feel as if it's more like a 6-weeker. That's a heavy weight to bear. He's the most important player, not only in his team, but arguably he's the best player in the competition outside of Dustin Martin. So has a huge impact on his team's chances. And now they can't win a grand final without him. Simple as that.
So that jury needed to make that clear, Brownie, if that was the case, because this is a precedent. And the AFL, as the keeper of the code, took this seriously, and they argued vigorously for it. Is whatever transpired at the elite would then be the trickle down. And I mentioned last night that those who are entrusted to run tribunals at the grassroots level start these cases at 6 weeks. And the AFL honoured that with their submission that it should be a 6-week suspension. And then they are let down on face value by the jury, because what that says is that this is a 3-week suspension. It enters the annals as 3 weeks. It doesn't enter as semi-final, preliminary final, grand final.
Yeah, absolutely. They should acknowledge that. And I want to put on the table too, Jared, I agree with the community and the junior aspect especially. I had a situation earlier in the year where I had to reprimand a coach in the opposition and pull him up for having a crack at a junior umpire. So I see that clearly, the effect that it can have. But they did need to make it very clear that I think finals have extra weighting, especially those last 3 weeks of the final. So that's sort of where I stand. I'm not sitting here banging the desk saying should have been 6 weeks, should have been 8 weeks, and I fully understand people's opinions, and they've got every right to make that opinion. Where were you on it? Well, were you absolute on 6 weeks, or you think it should have been more?
So I believe the AFL should have petitioned for 6 weeks, and they did, and in a way that was more critical than what the verdict has ended up being, because it does send the message that the league believes this to be 6 weeks. But equally, you cannot now walk past it. You can't walk past having asked for 6 weeks, having proven the case of aggressive, demonstrative and disrespectful, and let it sit as 3. So I expect...
There is different levels of those words, though, isn't there? So you can say 3 out of the 4, aggressive, demonstrative, disrespectful. The one that was left off the table was forceful.
And which they never asked for.
They never asked for. And I think Matt Stevick's testimony probably helped that case. That, it was reasonable that was left off the table. But there's different levels of that, isn't there? Like, you could headbutt an umpire, you could push an umpire over, and obviously you get more of a suspension. But there's various levels of those things.
Yeah, so the entry level was the request for 6 weeks, and then it escalates from there depending on the nature of it. So the precedent for the appeal, which, as I say, I think the AFL simply obliged to run this case. It's the Basher Hooley case from June 2017, where he was referred directly to the tribunal for striking. The AFL petitioned for a 4-week ban once he was found guilty. Richmond presented character evidence, which included a statement from the Prime Minister. The tribunal gave a 2-week suspension. the AFL took it to the appeals board and quickly had it doubled to the 4 weeks that they had asked for in the first place. So I would absolutely expect that to be the follow-through, and I imagine it would get heard at Thursday in the middle of the day. And to hear Gill talk as the keeper of the code, that's a heavy responsibility right now, and one they must test all the way through. Whether they're successful or not actually won't matter. But if they don't follow it through, then they have come up short of their own responsibilities.
Do you think they acknowledge the significance of missing finals? Because I know, and I've been on the end of this, they double suspensions in grand finals for misbehaviour there. I punched Josh Carr one year, didn't hit him hard enough because he got up and went on to play good footy. But the double the suspension, do you think they acknowledge that and take that into account?
No, because it's not mandated. Yeah. If it was a straight formula and they could say to the community this is a 6-week suspension, but it's simply not. In the way that it has come back today, this is a 3-week suspension, and it is too light for what the action is and for the guilt that was found. The other aspect, so the two most interesting aspects for me were what would the AFL petition for, and would Toby Greene and the Giants accept responsibility? And they didn't. They entered the plea of not guilty. This has been clever legally, and we'll work through this with Tom Morris because I share his view. I think at the moment the Giants are in front. So their legal strategy was sound. But that message of not absorbing it, you own this action cannot be permitted within the game, but you go in and plead not guilty.
Yeah, that was the one that surprised me the most, you know, because Toby should have just walked in and said, I'm guilty for being a goose. You know, I was hot under the collar and just lay yourself at the mercy of the tribunal and potentially get off to play in a grand final. That was his only hope, because ultimately that would have been the goal. Would have been the goal. They would have known, I think, you know, in their heart of hearts, that it was a big chance that he was getting suspended. So the home run hit is to try and get him up for a grand final potentially. So not even to lay himself at the mercy of the tribunal and plead guilty. Well, then you're going for the O.J. Simpson miracle, aren't you? You know, you're looking for the glove that doesn't fit, and they weren't able to find that glove, and it was always going to be a miracle for him to get off.
So the manoeuvring in this, let's bring in Tom Morris, who sat through the entire case. Tom, great to have you on board.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. Let's talk about Matt Stevic first of all. So Matt Stevic's role in this case was really important. He was the umpire that Toby Greene bumped. Let's go back to Saturday, because Matt Stevic didn't make a game day report at the time because he couldn't 100% be sure that Toby Greene had done what he'd done intentionally. But after the game, he was presented with the footage on a phone, and he was asked if he had anything to add to send an email to the Michael Christian, the MRO, which he did. And he sent that email, and he just said that there was minor contact, and he didn't believe that it was in any way forceful. Now, today, he didn't deny that Greene's action had been intimidating, but after essentially backing Greene the entire way through his testimony, which, as I said, went for 29 minutes, but in a balanced manner, he finished with this. And this is important because he'd really been on Greene's side, if there is such a thing, for the first 28 minutes. But then Matt Stevic said this: to be honest, I don't think it's a good look for the game. I don't believe the contact was forceful, but some may form the view that it was demonstrative. I would say there's an element of it being disrespectful. So his use of those two words, Jared, demonstrative and disrespectful, were really important. And the last line of Matt Stevic's statement, I guess, or his testimony, swung it back in the AFL's favour, or so we thought, until what we saw later on. But I think Matt Stevic, for the most part, was quite balanced, but the use of those two words was really critical in the way this case played out.
He did. He gave the jury 2 of the 3 that it ended up finding. What about Toby Greene? And the centrepiece here was the cross-examination of Jeff Gleeson.
Yeah, Toby Greene spoke for about 41 minutes. I think the vast majority of that was was answering questions from Jeff Gleeson, who is an experienced AFL QC. He said initially that he didn't realise he'd made contact with Stevic until after the game, and that is why he didn't apologise at the time, because he didn't actually know that it had happened. Jeff Gleeson replied, well, you were looking at him and you walked straight towards him and you had time to make up the decision, and that is why it was intentional. Now, Jeff Gleeson, he went very hard at him, posing a series of questions that probably morphed more as statements than questions. One of them was, the truth is you deliberately bumped into Stevic. Then he said, you did that because you're annoyed a free kick was reversed and it was an accident. And then you said, you did it. Then he said, you did it because you wanted to. Now, to each of these propositions, I guess you could call it, Toby Greene replied with the same 4 words: no, I did not. So Toby Greene was resolute in his innocence, in his not guilty verdict. This tit for tat lasted for about half an hour. now, and ultimately Greene flat out refused to acknowledge that he'd intentionally bumped Matt Stevic, and Jeff Gleeson kept going hard at him, but Greene, he held firm.
And then the legal manoeuvring around the submissions for penalty. So the AFL petitioned for 6 weeks, and the Giants, almost belligerently, I think, went fine rather than conceding any weeks at all.
Yeah, I think it was belligerent, Jared. I think if the AFL had argued for, let's say, 4 weeks, I think the Giants would have been far more accepting that it could have been 1 or 2 weeks. But because the AFL went for 6 weeks, the Giants went, no, we're going to go for a fine. Now, the maximum fine, Jared, as we've seen over the last several years, is $5,000. But the GWS QC, Ben Isle, he said, we are happy for a fine of 4 or 5 times that number. That is $20,000 to $25,000. At one point, he even referenced James Hurd's fine when he referred to Scott McLaren's umpiring in 2004 on the Footy Show as disgraceful, just to show how unusual this situation was. Now, the Giants said that the right penalty was that fine, and the AFL said 6 weeks. They haggled over the penalty. There was no acknowledgement from GWS that Toby Greene was guilty. In fact, they said quite the opposite the entire way through. And I agree with you. The term belligerent is probably just about right. Now, I also agree with you that the Giants have played the AFL on a break here. Although on the surface it looks like the AFL asked for 6, the Giants asked for a fine, and the tribunal has cut them down the middle. I think there's absolutely no doubt that although Toby Greene will miss 3 finals, the Giants are much more happy than the AFL are, and that's why the league is strongly considering appealing, and the Giants aren't.
Tom, thank you. So the Giants immediately accepted the verdicts, the AFL not so much. For what it means for the game, so the instant flinch reaction is huge advantage Geelong. The cautionary tale is the 19 preliminary final where it was the same thing. Yeah. Toby Greene got suspended, there were a set of injuries, all sorts of misfortune befell the Giants. They were broadly dismissed and they beat Collingwood.
Well, they were broadly dismissed 3 weeks ago when they played half a team against Geelong down at the Cattery, weren't they? No one thought they could win that night, and they came out and beat the Cats. So you only need to look at the recent past, and we were there for that 2019 prelim final. That was just unbelievable. The one thing is the Giants do play with. They play with tremendous spirit.
They are.
Leon Cameron, I always think the spirit's a reflection of the coach. So I said it last time on the couch, the straw poll at the start of the year, if you had to name a coach that's most likely to get sacked, I think Leon Cameron was on the block. And so he's just done an unbelievable job. Just quickly on that, if the Giants had pled guilty, so yeah, they're accused of being belligerent and all these sorts of things, which it looks like from the outside, but let's say they went in and pled guilty and said, look, I was being a goose. You know, they went for that. They went for the home run of trying to get off for a grand final. What do you think would have happened?
I don't think they would have got any fewer than 3, which is why I say I think their legal strategy has been really sound and it serves them well. I don't think it serves the code at all well, but for what they set out to do, and I thought last night this would go the opposite way if they argued every minute moment of it. They were proven right today, I think.
So what brought it down then for the tribunal?
No, well, there's no answer to that, Brownie.
Do you think it Matt Stevic?
It looks like they split the middle.
Okay, did Matt Stevic have an influence on him?
Kind of verdict.
Do you think? Because he's the only person that can really have a true observation.
He gave them guilty. He gave them guilty on 2 of the 3 that they ended up finding. No, it's perplexing how they landed at 3 rather than 6, and it is unexplained. Green's a recidivist, and Gary Lyon made the case with you last night that he can't be captain because he has this in him. Now, I don't want to lump it all in, but to a small degree, you've lived this journey. You were suspended for 16 matches until you got to 2004, and you straightened yourself up and you were barely ever suspended again. You shelved it all.
Yeah, well,
and assumed the leadership as a result of it.
Yeah, well, that's right. I was 21 years old, and I think it was 2004 that I might have missed 8 weeks, and then I got suspended in the grand final as well. So that carried over to the following year, of course. But let's call it, 13 weeks, you know. So 13 weeks, I'm healthy, sitting in the grandstand. Now, I was 21. The surprising thing, when I looked up today, Toby Greene's 27. I think, geez, he still hasn't learnt. But I thought at that point, at 21 years old, I'm wasted. I'm going into the prime of my career. I'm of no value to my teammates. Yes, I play in an aggressive manner. That's the way I get the best out of myself. Sometimes I get myself into some situations where I could be a little bit reckless. I need to be careful of that, and I need to think about that. So that's what I did and went forward. You know, in terms of anger management and all these sorts of things, I think Toby Greene's a smart guy. he needs to start to develop these strategies. Otherwise, he just continues to let his team down. From my experience, that's what I did, and I was proud of my tribunal after that, and I learnt my lesson.
There's one other element I want to address, and this is the myth that was exploded today is this notion of a Toby tax. And anybody who tries to peddle it to you from here, you should challenge on it. It's actually, it's the best discount in footy, this thing called the Toby tax. And it is those who invoke it, it's actually the polar opposite. And I'll tell you, I'll explain it to you. He was not suspended for the karate kick on Dalhouse. He was fined. His follow-up karate kick on Nick Newman, he wasn't even cited for. His first claw into the face on Bontempelli in a final series, he was fined for. He was saved a suspension with a huge fine. And the very next week he did it to Lachie Neale. He was only suspended because he got himself back there 7 days later. Earlier this year, he was given a 2-match suspension for the elbow to the throat, which he successfully had reduced to 1. And today they shot for 6 and he ended up with 3. That's right. It's the best discount in footy, the Toby tax. It makes things that are crystal clear somehow murky. And anyone who tries to peddle it from here, you ought to call him out on it because he has the most fortuitous record in the game. Never mind being persecuted. He's the luckiest guy in footy, Toby Greene.
I wouldn't have minded that record, actually. So 22 charges for only 10 weeks. I think I had about 8 for about 20-odd weeks, was it, Jared, or whatever you said before. So, yeah, it's he's had a bit of luck with it, no doubt about it. The thing that frustrates you with Toby is he's a wonderful player. We love watching him, and he's up there with the best in the game, no doubt about it. His importance to the team is unquestionable. But it's the peripheral sort of what I call them peripheral incidents. Yep. They're non-football incidents. And I defended him a couple of weeks ago, you know, in a football action where he did hit Dangerfield high. That's a football action. But how many of these peripheral incidents has he been involved with? You know, things that we just don't like the look of. Now he hits an umpire, you know, the eye gouge potentially. All these sort of funny incidents that are just not common and not classed as reckless or Toby being hot under the collar in a contest. You know, he's just got to get rid of that out of his game.
The other hammer blow today was confirmation of what had been feared for a long time, certainly in the state of Victoria, as the government relinquishing the grand final. So it's